Hey, welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people here who've come out to hear Dr. Bridges speak about the research that she has undertaken for her book. I know that there are some people here from outside of the Drexel community, which is great because we wanted to get this message out to as many people as we possibly could. Before I introduce Dr. Bridges, I want to provide a few brief remarks on the importance of her research findings, particularly for a College of Nursing and Health Professions and a College of Medicine, institutions that are charged with training and educating our future healthcare providers. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the term agnotology. Any hands? Maybe a few. Okay. If you're not familiar with this term, don't be surprised. It is relatively new. It was coined in the mid-1990s. Briefly stated, agnotology is the study of the causes of culturally induced ignorance that sometimes surround particular topics or subjects. One of the key reasons why the concepts of race and racism are so complex, so thorny, to the point where at times they appear to be virtually insurmountable, is that the concepts of race and racism have been subject to a high degree of culturally induced ignorance. For instance, is everyone aware that the concept of race, that is, a category used to classify human beings based on physical and biological traits, simply has no basis in reality? That's right. In 1998, the American Anthropological Association published a statement on race concluding that there exists no scientific biological foundation from which to make race-based claims. In fact, the very concept of race was simply made up, a socially constructed classification system created for a variety of political and economic reasons. Well, that sure is good to know. Race does not exist. It follows then that racism is based on an illusionary concept, a made-up story about how and why people look different from each other and therefore must be defined as different from each other. Now that we have cleared up this bit of confusion, we can move ahead and get on with our lives in a society free from the plague of racism, right? Everyone on board with that project? I am. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. As Nancy Krieger from Harvard University School of Public Health often reminds us, although race is a concept with no biological or scientific justification, it nevertheless exerts a deep-rooted presence in meaning in our culture and society. And this is due in large measure to the long historical legacy that the concept of race continues to exert upon our everyday lives. It is a history that can be traced back in part to the dawn of European global colonialism, the year 1492 to be precise. As the European colonizers began to occupy, enslave, and extract resources from conquered territories, questions surrounding the justification of such activities naturally arose. How does one justify genocidal campaigns and the subsequent enslavement of other human beings? The short answer? Simply classify them as less than human, that is, as subhuman, thereby sidestepping complicated questions concerning basic human rights. And parenthetically speaking, this is one of the areas where the concept of class, which is intimately linked with the concept of race, ties into the race equation. Anyone classified as subhuman will by default be excluded from certain classes. Well, as fate would have it, the socially constructed, politically and economically expedient concept of human racial classification stuck and took root within the laws of the land and then within the general human consciousness. In the 5 centuries since the events of 1492, the concept of race has become increasingly solidified, codified, institutionalized, reproduced, maintained, and woven into the fabric of everyday reality. The political philosopher Charles W. Mills, in his book, The Racial Contract, has brought attention to the litany of historical documents, legal legislation, folk myths, even scientific efforts to secure the concept of race as a binding entity. You might recall here scientific disciplines such as phrenology and eugenics that have been engaged in those practices. What we find from a review of this history is that the empty concept of race required centuries of political, economic, legal, social, and cultural entrenchment in order to become the meaning and value-laden concept that it is today. All of this is what brings us to our current presentation today. On page 112 of the book, Reproducing Race, Dr. Bridges quotes a passage from a 2005 Institute of Medicine report entitled, assessing racial and ethnic healthcare disparities. Where do we go from here? The passage she quotes reads as follows, and I'm quoting from the Institute of Medicine. Healthcare providers, like other members of society, may not recognize manifestations of prejudice in their own behavior. Okay, fair enough. While the Institute of Medicine report does not excuse instances of this behavior, it does appear to intimate that healthcare providers, like the rest of us, may simply be the unfortunate and unknowing victims of overpowering racist ideas, implying that we simply lack the ability to resist, rise above, and ultimately negate and overcome these widely prevalent ideas. At the end of the day, if we want to seriously confront and overcome the historical legacy of the concept of race, to potentially open up possibilities for new and inclusive futures, we should ask ourselves, particularly as health providers and educators of healthcare providers, the following question. Do we want to engage in a sincere attempt to help guarantee the most equitable and just outcomes for all patients across the board, bar none? I have to believe that we do want to do that, and I have to believe that we can do it, particularly if we engage the knowledge, tools, understanding, and awareness necessary to achieve those guarantees. And Dr. Bridges' sharing of her knowledge with us today is a key part of that equation. Now, having said that, I don't want to ignore or give short shrift to some of the great work being done here at Drexel to confront and negotiate the convoluted legacy of racism. Dr. Jamie Slaughter, who recently took a position at the University of Minnesota, has been engaged in research to determine, among other things, how varying degrees of healthcare treatment are applied to women of color. While Annie Madden from the Physician Assistant Department recently gave a conference presentation on racial and ethnic bias in healthcare. Of course, there is Michael Udell's ongoing work in the School of Public Health, as well as numerous other faculty involved in these issues across the university. Before I turn this over to our guests, I need to mention that bringing Dr. Bridges here to speak was truly a group effort. I want to thank our co-sponsors. Particularly, I want to single out Dr. Kelly Joyce. If it wasn't for Dr. Kelly Joyce bringing this book across my radar screen, I don't think it would have ever passed there. So this whole event is due to her. So thank you very much for that. Our other co-sponsors are great. I also wanted to thank Dean Laura Gitlin for her support of our board of diversity, equity, and inclusion for this event. And above all, though, I really need to thank Dr. Veronica Carey, who offered unwavering support, commitment, and encouragement for this project from the moment it was brought to her attention. It is somewhat difficult to convey just how meaningful that support is and has been. Our guest speaker, Dr. Khiara Bridges, holds a joint appointment at Boston University, where she is both a professor of law and a professor of anthropology. So try juggling that. She is also the Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Engagement at BU. In addition, her landmark 2011 book, Reproducing Race, she is the author of The Poverty of Privacy Rights, as well as two forthcoming books, Critical Race Theory, a primer, and the Cambridge Handbook of Surveillance and Race as co-editor. She is also the author of numerous journal essays and several book chapters. Now, these next couple of words I want to say, I've been wanting to say for a very long time. So here we go. Everyone, please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to Dr. Khiara Bridges.
Thank you so much. First of all, I feel like Beyonce, like with the coming from the backstage. But no, it's really so great to be here. I'm so excited to be invited, and also that you guys would show up. Like, I know that there's a million things you can do over the course of the day. So thank you for doing the thing that involved me. I'm going to talk for a little bit today. Also, I don't have slides, and I realize that that might be unusual because today the norm is to use slides, but I do talk with my hands. So if you need something to look at, I'm up here, all right? So for the first part of my talk today, I will describe my first book, Reproducing Race. And in the second part of my talk, I will discuss where my research has gone since the publication of that book. And spoiler alert, it has turned to examining racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality and morbidity. But first, let's talk about Reproducing Race. So that book is based on 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork research that I conducted in the obstetrics clinic of a large public hospital in Manhattan in 2006 and 2007. And I call the hospital Alpha in order to provide some degree of anonymity to the space. However, if you read the first 2 pages of Reproducing Race, and if you've even been in New York City for longer than 2 minutes, you can guess the real identity of Alpha Hospital. So almost all of the pregnant women receiving prenatal care in the obstetrics clinic at Alpha were poor, and all of them, except for one woman, relied upon Medicaid to cover the cost of her prenatal care expenses during her pregnancies. Now, this one woman who did not receive Medicaid during her time, or during my time at Alpha, paid out of pocket for her health care expenses. For her prenatal care expenses specifically. When I met her in 2007, she had recently gotten a new job, and she had switched to the health insurance provided by her new employer. It was when she signed up for her new employee health plan that she discovered that she was pregnant. Her insurance refused to cover her prenatal care. It said that her pregnancy was a pre-existing condition. Thanks, Obama. Anyway, so most women at Alpha were poor except for this one woman, actually, and almost all of them except for this one woman had Medicaid for their health insurance. Additionally, the very, very, very large majority of the pregnant women receiving prenatal care in the Alpha obstetrics clinic were racial minorities. And so for the first couple of months during that 18-month period of fieldwork, I sat in the waiting room of the obstetrics clinic and simply observed clinic traffic. I was trying to make sense of what appeared to be barely controlled bedlam. After I had familiarized myself with the staff, and more importantly, after the staff had familiarized themselves with me, I eventually moved behind the front desk and began the participant part of the participant observation of the clinic. And I eventually was able to not only move behind the front desk, but actually to work as a front desk worker, as an intake worker. And I would answer phones, and I would answer questions. I would greet patients. I would make appointments. I would administer urine pregnancy tests, etc. About a year into my field work, I moved into the nurses' triage rooms in the back of the clinic. And in those sites, I would observe women's preparations for their medical examinations. And after some time, I began to participate in these rooms by taking and recording women's weights and blood pressures. I would test the pregnant women's urine for the presence of glucose and protein. And over time, I was even able to observe patients' examinations with their physicians, nurse practitioners, and midwives. And in addition to all of this participant observation, I conducted over 120 hours of in-depth interviews with over 80 patients. And this was something, interviewing women for extended interviews, right? 2-hour long interviews. It was something that I was able to do because women had to wait inordinately long periods of time for their appointments with their providers. It was a public hospital after all. And I also conducted 50 hours of in-depth interviews with 30 providers and staff persons. So what exactly was I trying to get out of all of this field work? Well, I was hoping to say something insightful about the relationship between race and reproduction as a cultural artifact. And I hope that I accomplished that in the book. So the book proceeds from the assumption that race, as Jim Berge just explained, race is a discursive phenomenon, right? Race is ideas about difference. However, race becomes visible and tangible. It becomes material as those ideas are made to be reflected in the material conditions within society. Moreover, the material societal conditions appear to affirm the truth about ideas about race. And the unfortunate dialectic continues. So just as an example, right, we might have ideas that Black people are lazy, Black people are dirty, Black people are poor, and they have a lot of kids, right? These ideas are made to appear true as they are reflected in the conditions of society. As Black people suffer disproportionate rates of unemployment, as Black people are made to live in communities that are not proximate to jobs that pay a livable wage, as they are made to attend schools that are underfunded and they can't access education that will give them the skills to access good paying jobs, right? So then they appear to be lazy because they can't get jobs. They have to depend on the welfare state for their economic survival. And so then they're made to appear entitled. They have children, which we declare is inappropriate given their poverty. So any child that they have appears to be too many, right? So these ideas about race are reflected in the material conditions of society, and then the material conditions of society appear to affirm the ideas about race, and then the dialectic just turns and turns and turns, right? So, so this book examines this dialectical process of race formation as it occurs during women's pregnancies. The question, why pregnancy? Well, pregnancy engages racial discourses to such a dramatic extent that it's accurate to describe pregnancy as a racially salient event. And what I mean by that is that within political and popular discourses, the reproduction of Black and Latinx women is problematized. It's made into a social problem, right? The fact that these people would have kids. Think of the discourse of the welfare queen, right? That implicitly Black woman who has babies for the sole purpose, right? No other purpose but to increase the size of her welfare check. Ronald Reagan ran a successful platform for president, conjuring up the existence of the welfare queen, demonizing her, making people fear her existence, and then using that to win election to the highest political office in the land, and then using the welfare queen to reduce the size of what he called big government, which enabled her existence, right? Think also more recently of the discourse of the anchor baby, that Latinx baby whose mother insisted upon giving birth to her within the US borders for the sole reason of making claims on the US government. I mean, think of all this talk about revoking birthright citizenship. This talk is a direct consequence of the problematization of the reproduction of Latinx women. So Black and Latinx women's reproduction is made into a social problem. However, at the same time, white women are largely exempt from discourses that condemn their reproduction on the basis of their race. And the fact that white women are exempt from these discourses, while Black women and Latinx women are not, increases the racial salience of the event of pregnancy. So, although pregnancy is fairly described as a racially salient event, one of the greatest ironies that I encountered during my fieldwork with pregnant folks at Alpha, pregnant people of color at Alpha, was the absence of explicit discussions of race, even though it was obvious to me that race was essential to explaining why Alpha was the way that it was and why it persisted as this overburdened, underfunded space. The race is a powerful organizing principle at Alpha was suggested by the racial geography of the obstetrics clinic. So, while several of the physicians, the obstetricians who worked at the clinic were, this can be described as people of color, most of them were white. Yet these physicians were assisted by a support staff, nurses, intake workers, people we call PCAs, patient care assistants. That support staff was almost entirely composed of women of color. Moreover, during the period in which I conducted my fieldwork, most of the support staff persons were first-generation immigrants of color. So there is this fascinating, racially significant chain of command in the clinic. White people with the most power and prestige in the clinic sat at the top of the clinic hierarchy. Meanwhile, populating the ranks below them were their non-white assistants. Further, as I already mentioned, the large majority of Alpha patients were racial minorities. Thus, a predominantly white group of providers practiced medicine upon a largely disempowered, disenfranchised, marginalized, and problematized non-white group of patients. And so, although it was difficult to ignore or dismiss the racial geography of the clinic, very few of the people with whom I spoke during my fieldwork actually commented upon it. And actually, I was frustrated for many months by the refusal of any of my interlocutors to offer race as a relevancy, despite my sense that race could not and should not be ignored as a category that has produced Alpha again as the underfunded, overburdened space that it is. So what sort of insightful things do I hope to say about race, or the relationship between race and reproduction as a cultural artifact in the book? Well, I hope I say many of them in the book, but I'll tell you about two of them right now. In one chapter, I investigate the use of the term alpha patient population. In the clinic, everybody uses the term alpha patient population to refer to the individuals that receive Medicaid subsidized prenatal care from the clinic. And so I consider how it is that this vastly heterogeneous group of women, these women are Black, white, Asian, Latinx, Indigenous, South Asian, Australian. They're this incredibly diverse group of women. Also, while all of them qualify for Medicaid, right? Some of them have been living many generations of poverty, while some of them are recently poor. Some of them have college educations in grad school. Some of them never graduated from, anything beyond the second grade, right? So we have this incredibly heterogeneous group of people. Nevertheless, they could be reduced to a single population, the alpha patient population. And I wondered why, right? And so this population was also described as a high-risk population. And I kind of had to interrogate what exactly made this population able to be talked about and treated as high risk. And the only thing that they had in common, right, were that they all received, for the most part, Medicaid. And I thought that it was this shared Medicaid, the possibility of receiving Medicaid that enabled them to be identified as a high-risk population, and enabled them for the staff, providers, administrators, everyone, to embrace all of the incredible individual differences and construct them as a unitary population, right? So we have this singular population, but then I wanted to juxtapose this singular alpha patient population with the figure that staff, providers, and administrators offered when they spoke about the average alpha patient, right? So I would conduct these interviews with folks, and they would say things about, well, the average patient is, and the average patient that they often talked about was this undocumented, uneducated Latinx immigrant. Right, this undocumented, uneducated Latinx immigrant was offered to stand for the entire alpha patient population, despite the fact, as I mentioned, that the alpha patient population was incredibly heterogeneous. And so nevertheless, the providers allowed this undocumented Latinx immigrant to represent the entire alpha patient population. And these interviews led me to conclude that alpha patient population operated as a deracialized, but nevertheless racialized term. It allowed the providers, staff, and administrators who evoked it to tacitly speak about race, yet to avoid explicitly mentioning race. It's kind of like the work that terms like inner city and urban areas and hip hop culture, right, do. They allow us to talk about Black people, but we never have to actually talk about Black people, right? Same thing with welfare, right? People can talk about the welfare state and these welfare beneficiaries and welfare, and they're talking about Black people, but thankfully, they never have to mention Black people. They never have to mention race. So we can do a lot of things. We can demonize and damn welfare without ever having to demonize and damn Black folks, right? And that's exactly what alpha patient population does. It allows people to do things with race in a very comfortable way because they never actually have to say race. And so it's something that maybe we ought to think about, you guys ought to think about as you go out and do your work. Think about the work that your patient populations, right, those things, think about the work that it does, whether it does similar work, whether it allows people to talk about race without actually ever mentioning race. Another insight about race that I offer in the book relates to the acrimony that characterizes the relationship between the clinic staff and their pregnant patients. So clinic staff and the patients had this deeply antagonistic relationship. If we took the train down up actually to New York right now, we can wait like 15, 20 minutes and we'll probably witness an incredible blowout between a staff person and a patient. So I concluded in the book that this belligerence that characterized the relationship between staff and patients is rooted in the staff's perception of the patients as uneducated, yet incredibly shrewd, manipulators of the alpha system, right? Over the course of 18 months of talking to staff, they would always talk about patients. It's just like they're not bright, they're uneducated, they don't know that much about, you know, their bodies, they don't know that much about the US, they don't know that much about et cetera, right? They were uneducated, they were stupid. But then at the same time, they would describe them as like shrewd, right? They were like cunning. They were like able to like steal healthcare, and to take unwarranted and undeserved services from not only the hospital but also the U.S. Right? And so we had this wily patient, right? That's what I called her, this wily patient, this stupid but shrewd person. And after a while, I was like, well, the wily patient actually reminds me of the welfare queen. She's kind of similar. The welfare queen is this stupid woman, right? She's uneducated. She never went to school, not that bright, not bright at all. Nevertheless, cunning, right? She can bilk the US and federal and state governments out of billions of dollars if we don't stop her, right? If we don't do something, right? So the welfare queen and the wily patient were similar in that they were both this marriage of contradictions, stupid but shrewd. At the same time, the welfare queen is implicitly racialized as Black. I felt that the wily patient was implicitly racialized as non-white to the extent that it was something about the non-whiteness of the alpha patient population that made it easy for the staff to believe that they were wily. So I conclude in the book that the similarities between the figures of the wily patient and the welfare queen is not an accident at all. It's not a fluke. That is, the welfare queen and the wily patient are parallel figures because the wily patient is the welfare queen. She's just the welfare queen when she pops up in the obstetrics clinic of a public hospital. So it's no accident that the staff and providers and the administrators would treat their patients in the same way, and they would talk about their patients in the same way that we treat and talk about poor people in the US more generally. And the point is underscored if one considers that in the alpha obstetrics clinic, the wily patient is manifested precisely during her pregnancy. That is, the poor wily patient's pregnancy is the event that makes the welfare queen possible, the condition that makes the entire welfare apparatus necessary. If people, poor people, did not get pregnant, the idea goes, we wouldn't need such a large welfare state to begin with. And so wily patients were condemned and treated poorly because they were thought to be the condition of possibility for this very problematized welfare state that we have in the US today. So that's where my scholarship has been. So I would like to turn now to discuss where my scholarship is headed. And as an anthropologist, I like listening to and telling stories. So I'd like to introduce where my scholarship is headed now by telling you a story that comes from reproducing race. And it's the story of a woman who I call Rhonda. And I met Rhonda at her first prenatal care visit to Alpha. Rhonda was a native New Yorker and a woman of Puerto Rican and African American heritage, and she self-identified as Black. And because she appeared to be so friendly and talkative and open, I asked her if she was interested in speaking to me more extensively about her prenatal care experiences, and she agreed, and we made plans to talk during her next appointment. And she warned me, she said, "We're gonna need a lot of time, girl. I have a lot to talk about." So I was like, okay, cool. So her current pregnancy was her fourth. She had twin sons who were 13, a daughter who was 12, and another son who was 7. And she told me that her youngest son was a survivor. She had given birth to him at 26 weeks. And at birth, he weighed a little less than 2 pounds. And she spoke about him with so much love that throughout the interview, I found myself tearing up. She said that the medical conditions that he faced and would face for the rest of his life were daunting, but nevertheless, she described him as a happy kid. She said, quote, "It takes him a minute to get it out, but he talks. The doctor said he'd be a vegetable, said he'd never do anything, said he'd probably have hydroencephaly, he'd be institutionalized, but he talks. Too much, in fact. He doesn't walk. He has some issues. He's a quadriplegic. But the only way I can describe him is awesome." It was not until I had a chance to talk again with her that she revealed the true extent of her choice to call her son a survivor. Her son was one of a set of twins, but one of the babies, another boy, died shortly after birth. When I met her, she had just finished settling a lawsuit with a hospital that had delivered her sons. And she said that she filed the lawsuit 7 years earlier in order to get the answers that the hospital had refused to give her. She said, quote, "Somebody had to tell me why my child was the way he was and why my other son died. To be honest with you, I was prepared to lose, but they still would have had to say something. They would have been forced to say, this is what happened. That was my whole purpose." So over the course of the litigation, she learned that she had a group B streptococcal infection. Her medical records indicate that her physicians knew about it, right? They had documented it in her medical records. However, they never treated her for it. And she understood this finding as the answer that she had been looking for. But although she now had her answer, right, after 7 years of litigation, it still did not dull the pain of having to bury her child. She said, quote, "When I first gave birth to my sons, when I had them, first my husband came to me. When I first woke up, he was the first person I saw. He said that Yusuf, my surviving baby, needed a blood transfusion. Yusuf needed a blood transfusion, but Xavier, my son who died, was okay. He needed help breathing, but he was going to be all right." And I'm like, okay, because my only question was, are they okay? I want to see my babies. That was the first and only thing on my mind. I want to see my babies. And my husband, he said that they need blood. And I said, okay, well, call everybody. And he was like, I called everybody already. He let me know that he had called everybody in the family, and my family was coming to donate blood. That was Friday. And then my son took a turn for the worse. Just a day later, Xavier died. I went to the nursery to see Yusuf. I just had to see Yusuf. And then she continues after a long pause. She goes, "So after I left, I came upstairs very emotional. I'm automatically blaming myself, thinking I killed my son. I was in my room. They gave me I had my own room, 2 beds. I'm in my own room, hysterical. It was Saturday, it was quiet, and I was hysterical." So she describes the death of her son as a heartbreak that threatened her mental health even after the initial shock. In the months after his death, she began collecting stray animals. She stopped eating, stopped bathing, stopped caring for her other children. In fact, she checked herself into the psychiatric ward at Alpha Hospital because she thought that she was, quote, crazy. She said, quote, "Losing my son was such a tragedy for me. It was like, that's my baby. That's my son. I wanted those kids so much. I never got over it. I probably never will get over it." So at present in the US, the infant mortality rate for Black babies is more than 2 times the rate for white babies. This disparity has persisted despite the overall decline in infant mortality rates over the years. There has been no narrowing of the racial gap. Although the rate by which infants are dying in 2018 is lower than they were 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, the rate at which Black babies die remains twice that of white babies. And so perhaps it's easy to disconnect these shameful statistics from the experience that they quantify and describe. Perhaps talking about it in terms of rates and numbers dulls the senses and prevents outrage. Perhaps this explains the relative lack of public outcry and protest over what can dispassionately be called racial disparities in infant mortality and morbidity. But I tell Rhonda's story to put a face on otherwise disembodied numbers and rates. Instead of carrying home 2 babies wrapped in blue blankets, Rhonda brought home 1 baby and planned a funeral for the other one. She would have to think of a story to tell everyone who knew that she was carrying twins. Until word got around that one of the twins had died, how would she respond to the question, where's the other baby? And would Rhonda ever be able to look at her son who survived and not be reminded of her son who died? Infant mortality among Black people in 2016 occurred at a rate of 11.4 deaths per 1,000 live births. This is little less than twice the national average of 5.9 deaths per 1,000 live births. Again, perhaps these numbers alienate us from the human tragedy that they refer to. Black women experience Rhonda's pain at almost twice the rate of their white counterparts. Black women are twice more likely to know what it feels like to give birth but have no child to mother. Racial disparities in maternal mortality in the US are equally lamentable. Black women die from causes linked to pregnancy and childbirth at more than 3 times the rate of that of white women. In 2013, for every 100,000 white women who gave birth, 12.7 of them died. However, for every 100,000 Black women who gave birth, 43.5 of them died. Fortunately for me, during my field work, I never met a pregnant woman who died during or shortly after her pregnancy, so I cannot provide a story to help personify the abstract figures, but maternal mortality means that a child will grow up and never know the mother who gave birth to her. Maternal mortality means that a husband, boyfriend, or partner will have to somehow balance the joy of welcoming a new life with the devastation of encountering death. Maternal mortality is an event that, despite a cause of death being noted on the death certificate, remains inexplicable to those whom it affects. And so when one understands maternal mortality as a human tragedy, it seems manifestly unfair that this burden is imposed disproportionately on Black women, Black families, Black people. So the leading causes of maternal death have been identified as cardiovascular diseases, non-cardiovascular diseases, infection or sepsis, hemorrhage, cardiomyopathy, pulmonary embolism, cerebrovascular accidents, pregnancy-induced hypertension, which leads to preeclampsia and eclampsia, and ectopic pregnancy. Interestingly, the cause of death is unknown for 6.5% of all 2011-2014 pregnancy-related deaths. One study has reported that 54% of women who died from pregnancy-related causes had a history of chronic disease, including hypertension, cardiac disease, diabetes, scleroderma, and sickle cell disease. Obesity was the most commonly identified pre-existing condition. These are all chronic diseases that affect Black women at disproportionate rates. And the fact that Black women disproportionately suffer from these conditions that can make pregnancy dangerous, helps to explain why pregnancy and childbirth are deadlier for Black women. Now, some may hear what I've just said and say, what does race have to do with it? Their instinct may be that racial disparities in health are much more about class than race. It is well known that people of color are overrepresented among those living in poverty. Because of this, some may be led to believe that poverty, not race, explains why, when compared to their white counterparts, women of color are more likely to die on the path to motherhood, and infants of color are more likely to die before their first birthdays. And to be clear, the claim that these folks are making is that class, not race, explains racial disparities in health. And the claim is not at all outlandish. Social determinants of health refer to the conditions in which people are born, live, and work and age. They include the ability to access a good education and secure a non-hazardous job and healthy food and quality health services and safe and clean housing and a decent wage and social support. And social determinants of health certainly play a significant role in explaining racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality. And the conditions under which poor people who are disproportionately people of color live undeniably lead to their poor health states and poor health outcomes. Now, if poverty is responsible for the poor health states that people of color inhabit, then class, again, not race, is the real problem. And if class is actually the mechanism that leads to racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality rates, then progressive race scholars like myself might be barking up the wrong tree when we seek to investigate the effects that race and racism have on the health of non-white people. However, it seems like there is something up in that tree that we're barking under. Less metaphorically, several studies show that people of color have poor health outcomes even when you control for class. Consider racial disparities in maternal mortality. Wealthier Black women die during pregnancy and motherhood at rates that are significantly higher than their wealthier white counterparts. That is, racial disparities in maternal mortality persist across income levels. Thus, it is not only poor Black women who are dying on the path to motherhood, wealthier Black women are dying too, and they are dying more frequently than wealthier white women. This means that it's not solely poverty that is killing Black women. A similar phenomenon is in effect with respect to infant mortality. The infants born to wealthier Black women die at rates that are much higher than the babies born to wealthier white women. Indeed, racial disparities in infant mortality and morbidity rates increase as we move up the income ladder. That is, the rates at which poor Black babies and poor white babies die are actually closer than the rates at which wealthier Black babies and wealthier white babies die. In other words, when it comes to infant mortality, poor Black people and poor white people have health states that are more comparable to one another than the health states of wealthier Black people and wealthier white people. This suggests that we as a society definitely need to work to reduce the effects that poverty has on health, but we also need to work to reduce the effects that race has on health. So, in the balance of my remarks, I will quickly discuss, because I want to get to Q&A, I will quickly discuss various potential contributors to racial disparities in infant and maternal mortality rates. Critical thinkers have identified a variety of mechanisms that might explain the existence and persistence of racial disparities in health generally, and in infant and maternal mortality rates specifically. And we can divide these explanations into structural causes of health disparities and individualist causes of health disparities. But before exploring the explanations that critical scholars have embraced, I think it's important to discuss explanations for health disparities that critical scholars have rejected. And the first, and this might be the most controversial thing that I say today, the first is the idea that genetic differences between the races explain racial disparities in health. And the second is the idea that the behaviors in which people of color engage their culture wholly explain their compromised health. I'm going to start with genetics. So critical scholars resoundingly reject the idea that genetic differences between the races explain racial disparities in health. Nevertheless, there is always a study popping up somewhere that offers to explain racial disparities in health in genetic terms. For example, in 2012, a group of researchers at Boston University, my home university, sought to identify the, quote, role of genetics in Black women's experiences with cancer. A news story covering their research explained that, quote, the phrase cancer disparities refers to more than racial or socioeconomic gaps in access to cancer diagnosis and treatment. As it turns out, all other things being equal, race and ethnicity account for significant differences in the incidence and survivability of certain cancers and in how well people respond to standard treatments. Cumulative findings from several studies indicate that regardless of their incomes and how early they are diagnosed, African American women are more likely to die from breast cancer than their white counterparts. Quoting one research, the article says, at all ages, mortality from breast cancer is higher for Black women, and it's clear now that it's not due to differences in access, care, or treatments. Now, the title of this article, again, is The Role of Genetics in Black Women's Experiences with Cancer. And the commitment in the scientists' research is that genetic variation between racial groups explains elevated breast cancer mortality rates among Black women. The problem is that those who claim that genetic differences between races explain health differences between races have never been able to identify the genetic variation that is specific to the racial group. The failure to identify race-specific genetic variations is due to the fact that such race-specific genetic variations do not exist. Researchers who propose that genetic differences are causing racial disparities in health usually reach this conclusion after they have controlled for other potential causes of the disparity, like income, like socioeconomic status, like access to health insurance and health services. Now, although these researchers may eliminate many non-genetic causes of any given racial disparity in health outcome, they never identify the genetic cause of the disparity. Their faith that genetic variation between the races exists leads them to presume that such a genetic cause of the disparity exists. Consider the BU researchers that I just mentioned. Although they conclude that differences in access, care, or treatments do not and cannot explain racial disparities in breast cancer mortality, they never identify the genetic variation that is the culprit behind why breast cancer is deadlier for Black women. They cannot do this, critical scholars say, because such a genetic variation is a figment of our collective imagination. So critical scholars believe that we ought to oppose the claim that genetic variations between the races explain racial health disparities because the empirical research cannot support it. As Dorothy Roberts puts it, I love Dorothy Roberts, She says, quote, "It is implausible that one race of people evolved to have a genetic predisposition to heart failure, hypertension, infant mortality, maternal mortality, diabetes, and asthma. There is no evolutionary theory that can explain why African ancestry would be genetically prone to practically every major common illness." But we also ought to oppose the claim that racial health disparities can be explained in terms of genetics because they are a dangerous distraction from the mechanisms that actually explain why people of color are sicker and die earlier than their white counterparts. Think of racial disparities in infant and maternal mortality. When you're like me and you're convinced that these disparities are caused by structural factors like residential segregation and the unhealthy housing stock found in neighborhoods that people of color call home, like the clustering of environmental hazards in segregated neighborhoods of color, like high unemployment rates, like the unavailability of health insurance and quality health services. When you're like me and you believe that these factors are killing women and infants of color, then any suggestion that genes are killing women and infants of color sounds like an excuse. It sounds like an excuse not to address what is really causing the deaths of Black women and their babies. Roberts, again, has made this argument quite forcefully in her scholarship. She writes, quote, "Researchers still do not know why Blacks get and die from heart failure at a much earlier age than whites. But if I were a scientist, I would start looking at the effects of young Black men's 75% chance of being incarcerated in some cities. Heart disease researchers should be more interested in the fact that Black men are 7 times more likely than whites to be imprisoned in this country than the less significant genetic differences many are so fixated on." So critical scholars have rejected the claim that bad genes are causing racial disparities in infant and maternal mortality. They also reject the claim that behavior explains these disparities. Now, it is undeniable that one's behavior affects one's health. There is a greater likelihood that a person who eats healthy foods and works out every day will have better health outcomes than a person who eats fatty, high sodium foods, drinks sugary beverages, smokes cigarettes, and doesn't exercise, of course. However, that undeniable truth that unhealthy behaviors lead to unhealthy outcomes is more problematic when unhealthy behaviors are imagined to constitute a culture that explains racial disparities in health. Differently stated, we ought to be wary of arguments that people of color's culture leads them to engage in behaviors that compromise their health. One hears cultural explanations of racial disparities in health ever so often. For example, there's an argument that the Tuskegee experiment has led to a culture of distrust of physicians and other healthcare providers among Black Americans. This culture is thought to have damaging health consequences as it leads Black Americans to refuse to seek medical care when they ought to do so. Another example is the argument that indigenous culture leads the people steeped in it to consume excessive amounts of alcohol, which causes hypertension, stroke, liver disease, and an assortment of cancers. Another example is the argument that the foods that comprise the cultural repertoire of soul food, foods that Black Americans are believed to eat because it is part of their culture, are the sugary or high fat, high sodium foods that lead to obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. The problem, according to critical scholars, is that it is distracting to conclude that when people of color engage in unhealthy behaviors, it is because their culture made them do it. It distracts from the reality that oftentimes the lives of people of color have been constrained in ways that make unhealthy behaviors the only option. In other words, the behaviors of people of color may not be chosen in the usual sense of the term. If people of color do not go to the doctor as often as they should, it may be because they're uninsured or because they lack access to health providers. If people of color drink alcohol to excess, it may be because they're coping with poverty and racism and unemployment. If people of color eat foods that are high in fat, salt, and sugar, it may be due to those foods being the only affordable options in their neighborhoods. Y'all, there's a dollar menu at the McDonald's. There's no dollar menu at Whole Foods. I checked. So genetics and culture are the explanations of racial disparities in infant and maternal mortality that we ought to reject. And so briefly, I will talk about the ones that deserve more full interrogation. Start with social determinants of health. As I mentioned, social determinants of health are the conditions under which people live, eat, work, age that affect their health states. These structural factors go a long way towards explaining the poorer health that people of color have. There are studies upon studies documenting that the environments in which racial minorities live, work, play, and age are all likely to compromise their health. And it's important to underscore that there is nothing inevitable about the fact that people of color inhabit the most polluted environments. There's nothing inevitable about the fact that people of color inhabit these environments while also lacking the means like health insurance to protect their health. The World Health Organization's position on this issue is compelling. It has said, the unequal distribution of health damaging experiences is not in any sense a natural phenomenon, but is the result of a toxic combination of poor social policies and programs, unfair economic arrangements, and bad politics. We can fix it. We just need the political will to fix it. So social determinants of health are likely contributors to racial disparities in health. Another likely contributor is stress. That is, individuals' physiological response to external stimuli. There has been some research supporting the proposition that stress contributes to disease and ill health. Relevant to maternal and infant mortality, some studies show that women who have high stress jobs give birth to lower birth weight babies than both those women whose jobs are not stressful or those women who can control certain aspects of their stressful jobs, like when and whether they can take a break. If stress does indeed compromise health, then it likely contributes to racial disparities in health. And just to put it plainly, because being not white in this country is stressful. Doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich. Doesn't matter if you're documented, undocumented. It's stressful to be a person of color. I was hypertension last night watching those election results come in. So think of the cumulative effect of that. So social determinants of health are likely contributors to racial disparities in health. Another one is provider bias. I was so happy that Jim Berge mentioned in his introduction, the Institute of Medicine, or IOM, which is now called the Health and Medicine Division, or HMD, whatever, the IOM released a report documenting that the poverty in which Black people disproportionately live cannot account for Black people being sicker and dying younger than their white complements. The IOM found that people of color receive lower quality health care than white people, even when one controls for insurance status, income, age, and severity of conditions. And by lower quality health care, the IOM meant the concrete inferior care that physicians give their Black patients. The IOM reported that racial minorities are less likely than white people to be given appropriate cardiac care, to receive kidney dialysis or transplants, and to receive the best treatments for stroke, cancer, or AIDS. So many studies have buttressed the IOM's findings by documenting that providers are less likely to prescribe and deliver effective treatments to people of color when compared to their white counterparts, even after you control for characteristics like class, health behaviors, comorbidities, and access to health insurance. In light of these studies, we might be able to make an argument that if people of color are sicker and are dying younger than white people, this may be because physicians have racial biases, and their biases may cause them to give their patients of color inferior health care, and in so doing contribute to higher rates of morbidity and mortality among people of color. Most researchers doing work in this area have looked into implicit biases, right? Biases that physicians are not, or healthcare providers are not consciously aware of, but that nevertheless lead them to make unintentional and ultimately harmful judgments about the care that they give people of color. When physicians, so first of all, physicians tend to have the same results on the implicit association test as the general population. And the implicit association test, as many of you all know, asks providers to, or asks people, test takers, to link Black and white faces with happy and unhappy words under intense time constraints. And when you have a pro-white implicit bias, it's easier for you to link the white face with the happy sounding words. You can do that faster than linking the Black face with the happy sounding words, and also vice versa. It takes longer for the white face to be linked to the unhappy sounding word, and it's just quick to link the Black face with the unhappy sounding word. So first of all, when physicians and healthcare providers are given the implicit association test, they tend to have the same outcomes as the general population, and the general population tends to have a pro-white implicit bias. Moreover, studies have shown that when physicians who have the results of their IATs show that they have pro-white implicit biases, they make different choices around the healthcare that they give their patients of color and their white patients. And those choices reflect the implicit biases that they are shown to have. So for example, physicians who had high pro-white implicit biases were more likely to prescribe thrombolysis, which is a very aggressive yet effective treatment for kidney disease or cardiac disease. They were more likely to prescribe that treatment for white patients and less likely to prescribe that treatment for their Black patients. Also, physicians that were shown to have high pro-white implicit biases were more likely to prescribe opioids to their patients and less likely to prescribe it to their Black patients. So if these studies are up to something, we might need to investigate how implicit biases are contributing to racial disparities in health more generally, and racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality more specifically. So to recap, social determinants of health, stress, provider biases are all likely explaining racial disparities in infant and maternal mortality and racial disparities in health generally. The final likely contributor is epigenetics. Epigenetics involves changes in the expression of genes that do not involve a transformation of the gene sequence itself. As such, epigenetics concerns changes in phenotype without a corresponding change in genotype. The idea behind epigenetics is that several factors, including the environment, can cause genes to be expressed differently without the genes having undergone a mutation. Individuals who have been exposed to environments that have caused changes in their gene expressions, that is, their epigenomes, these individuals may pass those epigenetic changes along to their children. And as a result, it only slightly overstates the case to say that children can be exposed to the environments that their parents and grandparents lived. And epigenetics is the medium for that environmental exposure. The field of epigenetics is important to scholars interested in racial disparities in health because it may explain why poor health has persisted across generations in people of color. Epigenetics suggests that racial minorities living today may have inherited epigenomes that reflect the overtly hostile environments that people of color had to inhabit in times past, when they were the subjects of chattel slavery and Japanese internment and forced removal to reservations, etc. Consider racial disparities in infant and maternal mortality, right? Might epigenetics explain this phenomenon? Could it be that the hostile environments in which Black women lived in decades past caused changes in their epigenomes? And could it be that these epigenetic changes, which cause morbidity and mortality excessively in infants born with these genetic expressions, could it be that these epigenetic changes have been passed down over their generations, elevating the rates at which Black infants die at present? Could epigenetics explain why wealthier Black women's class privilege cannot protect their health or the health of the infants that they have? So, while epigenetics is a burgeoning field that may help us understand the persistent nature of racial disparities in health, some critical scholars have sounded a warning about the endeavor. Dorothy Roberts is one. She cautions that epigenetic understandings of racial minorities' compromised health states may slip into arguments about racial minorities' genetic inferiority. And she counsels that the line, quote, between the genome and the epigenome can seem blurred. When scientists write that epigenetic effects of racial discrimination are durable across generations, it sounds perilously close to biological theories of race. The point of this research should not be to consign another generation to the biological fallout of past discrimination. To the contrary, its hopeful message is that epigenetic changes are caused by the environment and therefore can be environmentally interrupted so that future generations can enjoy better health. So, in conclusion, social determinants of health, stress, provider bias, and epigenetics are all likely contributing to the tragic rates by which pregnant women of color, new mothers of color, and babies of color are dying. And we ought to investigate these likely contributors to racial disparities in infant and maternal mortality rates. And more importantly, we have to change what we are doing around this issue. We have to. That's the only way that we can reduce the frequency of stories like Rhonda. And so that is all.
Dr. Bridges, thank you very much to come to Philadelphia and to give us your talk. As an anthropologist and a lawyer, It's refreshing to hear your perspective outside those of us in this room. Many of us in this room in the College of Nursing and Health Professions, as I look around, I see nurses like me who have worked, when I was a new labor and delivery nurse 40 years ago at the Hospital University of Pennsylvania, when the field of maternal fetal medicine was just starting, and one of our lawyers' fathers has advocated to make sure that all women, no matter where they come from, colorblind, get the best medical care. 40 years ago, we've come to a very different place. So I see doctors, I see nurses, I see community activists. Philadelphia has the highest infant and maternal mortality rate compared to all large cities. Probably about 10 years ago, people were screaming about that. The NIH had the National Children's Study. Congress mandated that resources be allocated to better understand the epigenetics. 2012, 2014, the NIH shut down the National Children's Study. The NIH is no longer fostering research to better understand how we can mitigate the social determinants that foster our high infant mortality. What is your advice for us? We once had community obstetrical centers. The nurses and the doctors that care so deeply were demonized. We're the ones that don't care. But when I became a pioneer nurse practitioner in this city 38 years ago, I had an hour if I needed it. Actually, the hour was standard for a first prenatal visit. A midwife in the community came to me just last week and she said, the schedule gets messed up. I have 10 minutes to care for a woman who has psychiatric diagnoses, of medical diagnoses. We need help. What are we going to do? Nobody is screaming about this. And one other thing, in 1920, the National Research Institute made a priority to try to understand the differences between between Black and white infant mortality rates. And there was a lot of research in the 1920s. Think about 1929, the stock market crashed. What happened 10 years ago? As Jim has been my key teacher, America really created eugenics. We were the forerunners in the scientific world. So think about 2008, 2000 to about 2014, we were funding so much research to try to better understand how we can really make a difference. 2008, the economic downturn, and look where we are at 2018, and look at what just happened last night. Help us. How can we help our mothers who care so deeply about their babies and their families?
Yeah. That's a great question. So as a lawyer, a lot of people expect my answer to be something along the lines of, well, we need better laws, we need better policies. But I'm also an anthropologist, and I think that we need cultural change. And the best precedent for cultural change that I've ever seen is the civil rights movement, which is to say we need to take it to the streets, right? Law will only reflect what we demand for it to. The Constitution will only mean what we force it to mean. And we can force constitutional change, we can force the passage of laws, we can force policy, we can force funding to be given to investigating these questions, to allowing midwives and other healthcare providers to be able to spend more than 10 cursory minutes with a new patient with a host of health issues. We have to organize. We need a social movement. We need to go into the streets, and we need to stay in the streets until we force the change that we demand. And it's not gonna happen by a very slick argument that a litigator makes to a court. It's not going to happen by a policymaker who just happens to think that this is, something, so let me push this through. It's going to happen because the people demand it. And, the election, some people thought that those were good results. Like, I'm still terrified. I'm still terrified that it was close and that it wasn't, the Senate is still dominated by the Republican Party. Like, the change that we saw last night, if it is actual change, is a result of people actually going out there into the streets. And we need to do it around questions of health. We need to do it around questions of mass incarceration. We need to do it around questions of immigration policy. We just need to force the change that we demand.
Okay. Any other questions? before somebody maybe has something that they want to come up with, I just had a question, and that was, I think it was like around between pages 74 and 76 of your book. There's you have a discussion. You have a discussion about how race has evolved over time, has manifested itself in a number of different guises over time, oftentimes not allowing us to recognize it forthright.
Right.
In the years since the publication of your book, 2011, has there been some evolution, some changes that we should be aware of, that we should be able to anticipate and to know about?
Yeah, I think that what has changed since my book is just the overtness of race, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's not. So back in 2006 and 2007, when I was conducting my research, back then it was unacceptable to problematize explicitly. I mean, we weren't talking about building a wall between the U.S. and Mexico. The idea of starting a Muslim registry or shutting down immigration from Muslim majority countries was like wasn't something that was acceptable political discourse. And so now it is. And so I think what has changed is that it's very easy to identify the problematized populations, as well as it's very easy to identify the way that race is informing our policies around immigration, but also around health and et cetera. So I think that one thing we have to be mindful of is that although we have explicitly identified our loathed others now, we ought not to be sanguine that the other loathed others of past are off the hook, right? So the reproduction of Black folks is just as demonized as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even though we're only speaking about anchor babies in the news. So and also, the reproduction of poor white women is not exactly embraced, right? It's not exactly supported. We're not funding healthy outcomes for poor white people. So I think that we ought to be mindful of the democratic, the very democratic maligning of the reproduction of unpopular populations, even though our attention tends to be drawn towards the ones that are in the front page of the newspapers, which is Muslim and Latinx people.
Yeah. Okay.
I wanted to ask, just because we're all within the helping profession, it's how does that look to organize and demonstrate when you are in a precarious situation of needing to be present for also your clients, your participants? Because if we were to do a sit-in or walk out, then who would take care of the people that are affected by the system that we're working in?
Right,
so
yeah.
I just
No, that's a wonderful question. I would say, people had to make sacrifices. My ideal, the idea that I have in my head is the civil rights movement, and people made sacrifices during that time. Now, I would never ask that you sacrifice the health of your patients, right, for their betterment. There has to be a way that we have to imagine a way where we can be collective, right? So we can join forces, the patients together with the providers, and figure out a way that united we can protest together without one group's well-being being sacrificed for the other. I think it's a terrible idea to say, I'm not going to work today, and so therefore my patients are just, out of luck. When we get justice, then you get health care. But rather, I mean something that makes a demand on the state, in the way that the civil rights movement did, the Edmund Pettus Bridge March, right? The Freedom Rides, things that make a demand on the state, that embarrass the U.S. on the world stage, that show that the U.S. likes to think of, these countries as its peer nations, but is not at all peers when it comes to health outcomes and maternal and infant mortality rates. And it has to be on that level without necessarily a sacrificing of the actual lives of the people who depend upon you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I think we got time for one more. Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think, given that we're in a university setting right now, what do you think that the role of universities and of education for health providers is? And also, sort of a side question, I hear a lot, like, I don't want to get political in nursing classrooms. I'm a former women's studies major, so I'm like, let's always be political. Why not? So also, like, how do you think that contributes to
Right.
the issue?
Well, I think so. To the first question, the let's not get political. We're just in nursing class right now. I think it's important for people to challenge that, and I think it's important to challenge it in that space, which is to say, the choice not to be political is a political choice. The choice to understand what you're doing is not at all involved in the politics of the day or is not infected by the politics of the day. That's a particular political commitment right there. And so at that point, you have to justify and demonstrate that political commitment is better than the one that I'm interested in, which is always being conscious of the social context and cultural context and political context of the things that you're learning. So I think challenging those moments, there's no neutrality, right? The choice of neutrality is not at all neutral. So I think disabusing folks who make that claim of that notion is very important, so that you can actually move the conversation to one that is more honest, really, about what we're deciding to do and what we're deciding to talk about. And then what is the role of universities and schools? I have to say that you all in the health professions and nursing and obstetricians and MDs and PhDs, you're actually in a much better position than I am to make truth claims about health, right? Because we have like a hegemony with regard to who can actually make truth claims. I mean, it's being challenged again in the present moment by this like war on facts and war on science. But nevertheless, science and the ability to make truth claims from a discipline that is identified as like hard science is privileged above other truth claims that are made. So that is like a wonderful privilege that you all have, is that when you say something about racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality, or racial disparities in health, or about the experiences that your clients are your patients are living, or the experiences that you have in the clinical encounter, that's going to be received with much more validity and weight than claims that myself as a lawyer and as an anthropologist can't make. So use your privilege, right? Use your privilege to describe and critique and to suggest ways that we might resolve the problems that we all agree are problems.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right.